Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince is a brand new monster taming RPG available for Nintendo Switch that features a plethora of easy to learn, hard to master systems like the 4-on-4 turn-based combat, the fusion or synthesis system which allows you to bring two monsters together in order to create a more powerful being, the wide array of talents that each monster can learn which can also be crossed over with synthesis, and around 500 monsters to scout and utilize as a monster wrangler. The game also features a wide array of biomes, a fun story that doesn't take itself too seriously whilst also tackling some pretty dark undertones, some really unique monster designs, and more. Today we're going to be diving into this game and dissecting it from three major categories that I believe are important to any monster taming fan, that being the plot, which we will only touch on a little bit because I don't want to dive too much into spoilers, especially this early on. Then we'll go into the gameplay, which will be the bulk of this video, as we got a lot going on here. In this section we'll discuss progression, performance, and just how the game feels in general when playing through it. Then we'll briefly go over the different types of monsters you can expect to see from a design perspective. That said, make sure to sit back, relax, subscribe for daily monster taming videos, and let's dive in. Okay, so the game has you start off as Sorrow, a half-human, half-monster, and second-born son of the Demon King. You find out pretty early on that you've essentially been abandoned by your father, and your mom is deathly ill with some sort of virus or something. As a child, you're told essentially to repress your monster half and pretend to be human until you do something good for someone. Then the humans essentially burn up your house and chase you out of town. Frustrated, you seek out and try to beg your father to heal your mother's sickness, and the Demon King basically says, "I could do it, but I'm not gonna, lol." Then you try to fight your dad, at which point he curses you, making it so you cannot actually hurt anyone with monster blood. This sets up the premise for the game, which is that you take up arms as a monster wrangler instead of a direct combatant, but that happens a bit later. You find out later that your mom died while the whole escapade was going on, and this big dragon dude tries to convince you to relinquish your demon side and become full human, but Sorrow's not really having it. Anyways, cut to a few years later, you're sort of taken in by this human village and they end up accepting you and also try to help you resolve this curse that prevents you from fighting against monsters. Eventually, some monsters come to town and you're unable to defend anybody since you can't fight them, and are saved by one of the elders who utilizes monsters in battle, and this leads to you being taught the ways of monster wrangling, which again is utilizing monsters for combat instead of oneself. You eventually decide to compete in some monster coliseums, end up meeting an elf who might actually be able to help you lift your curse and allow you to traverse to various dimensions. There's also a cat and more. Essentially, the game starts out with you seeking to kill your father, and you're basically trying to amass enough power to do so through monster wrangling. I'm heavily oversimplifying things here just for the sake of timeliness and because I don't want to spoil too much, but the story, while nothing groundbreaking, is quite unique in that it has you essentially motivated by bloodlust instead of some sort of, need to be good or typical hero archetype, which I quite like about this game. The game does have a lot of connections to Dragon Quest IV, but I haven't played that, so I'm not going to really comment on those connections here. All in all, I found the story to be quite fun and not too overbearing, which I quite like. The cutscenes are good and they don't overstay their welcome. Okay, next we got the gameplay, and there's a lot to break down here, so I'm going to be going through it pretty quick, but do note that I have a lot of videos breaking down various aspects of the game, which I will leave linked below. The game features 7 different realms to explore, the first of which is a human realm, and the other are the 6 monster realms, which also consist of 3 different echelons, making for a sort of open, segmented world with a bunch of different areas to explore, kind of like Legends Arceus, but with more total worlds that are probably a bit smaller each, but overall I think it is a bigger world than that game. As you travel through these various areas, you're given usually a major quest to take care of, which will build your reputation in that area, and you basically go through the different areas. Sometimes you're given an option of which one you can go to first, and the story progresses at the end of each one of those quests. The combat in the game features a standard 4-on-4 with different sized monsters, sort of changing it up a little bit, and that large monsters, which are more powerful and can hit more often, will take up 2 slots instead of 1, but essentially the combat system normally is 4-on-4. Monsters, just like in any RPG, are made up of stats, and instead of having strict movesets, they actually have something known as talents, which are essentially a list of abilities or buffs that they can get based on their monster's species. A talent might grant a monster a bunch of different moves based on how many talent points you put into it, or a bunch of buffs. Monsters also have passive traits that are just like abilities in Pokemon. There are multiple based on level, and they even have individual resistances and weaknesses as well. There are a few different options in combat. During most battles, you are given a plethora plethora of choices and can command your monsters individually. However, in Colosseum battles, this is not the case. The monsters will attack on their own based on the tactics and instructions that you've set for them. This is very customizable, mind you. I've seen some comments from people saying that it's essentially just a no-brain auto battler when you go to these areas, but that cannot be further from the truth. You can set certain moves to be more likely or less likely to go off. You have a ton of control of how the monsters are built with synthesis, which we'll get to in a second, and you can actively change your tactics mid-battle. So if you hear anybody saying that it's a mindless auto battle, it's because they likely don't understand the systems in the game and are sort of just letting things go off without actually putting any thought into it. But that being said, Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince also features a robust fusion system that allows you to take any two monsters in the game and fuse it into a new monster. This gives you a ton of control of how they're built because fusion will also pass over talents and talent points, and you can even fuse talents together to make stronger talents. The game is super intricate with its fusion system. There are monsters that can only be obtained through fusion, and even some monsters that require specific grandparents in order to be created as well. I've already seen people online putting together these crazy trees in order to achieve certain monsters, and while the vast majority of players will never really have to get into that side of things, it does heavily exemplify the fact that the game has a very high ceiling when it comes to knowledge and skill, but is also very approachable for the average player. I was a little worried when getting into this game that it'd be too complex for most people to want to play it, because I have seen games that overwhelm you with a bunch of content but don't really explain it well, but honestly, I think they did a pretty good job here. Now, I do have a few critiques, and it mostly has to do with the sort of in-game progression. My first issue with the game is that you are given a nerfed scouting odd when capturing monsters in a new area until you've built reputation in that area. Well, on paper, that doesn't sound too bad. It does get frustrating when you are playing through an area, wanting to catch a bunch of really cool monsters, only to realize that you're going to have a significantly harder time to do so until you've completed that area itself. By then you might not want to backtrack, and while I don't mind it too much, I will say that it does break flow a little bit, having to backtrack every area, because scouting does become a pain if you don't have the appropriate rep. Another very minor issue I found is that pretty much every big hitter or boss is highly resistant or immune to a bunch of the status effects in the game. Like every time I fight a boss, I can't put it to sleep, I can't stun it, and even the status effects that will work on it half the time are so heavily resisted that it always causes a miss. I understand the thought process behind this. They basically don't want people to just stun lock and sleep hacks all the bosses, but it does leave some of the monsters' movesets feeling kind of useless when not interacting with these bosses. The bright side is these status effects can still shine in the Colosseums, but it just kind of bugs me when I'm fighting a big boss and half my moveset isn't available. I'm also not a massive fan of how rare large monsters are early on, and especially considering the fact that the deluxe bundle kind of circumvents this issue, which I'm not a fan of as well. Basically, large monsters are really strong and can randomly appear in the overworld, but they are very rare. And furthermore, fusing for large monsters is also a bit of a pain, but if you did purchase the deluxe version of the game, it makes it a lot easier with one of the areas in the game. And I'm not a big fan of day one DLC. It just feels kind of dirty. I understand if you bought it, I did too, and maybe I'm a little guilty for supporting it. I just really want these games to continue to come to the West, but I do think they should have buffed large monster spawn rates a little bit. I'm not saying make them appear everywhere, but at least like a good 25% buff or something like that. Other than that, progression feels really good. There were a few times where I felt myself kind of lagging behind just because I'm recording a Let's Play, so I don't really want to grind too much off screen. Kind of a content creator problem. If you do feel under-leveled, it doesn't take a long time to get to the point where you are on par, so that's not really an issue, especially since you can set the game to auto battle for you in the wild, which literally lets you do that while you're doing something else in your own time, which I quite like. Now, finally, before we discuss the monsters in this game, I will say that the Switch does have performance issues, not as bad as Scarlet and Violet, like what a lot of people are saying, but probably worse than Monster Hunter Stories 2 or Shin Megami Tensei 5. The game in and of itself is not broken because of this. I haven't found any game-breaking performance issues or glitches or save files being deleted. What I will say is that I can get over the performance issues since the game in every other aspect is honestly a lot of fun and filled with content. It's no secret that the Switch is not the most powerful console, and even avid defenders of the Switch who claim that Zelda has no frame rate issues are just lying because the Korok Forest exists. Not that it's not amazing that they got the Zelda games to work on the Switch, but I'm just pointing out that the Switch does have performance issues nonetheless. Anyways, monster designs. The game features roughly 500 monsters that you can tame, and they're broken down into several families like the slime family or the dragon family, which are pretty self-explanatory. One thing I like about the designs in Dragon Quest monsters is that they're very unique and recognizable, and a lot of them are out of the box. Sure, you have your basic slime creature and stuff like that, but you got a ton of monsters that are just ideas that you would never think of. They're just crazy. They kind of remind me of cassette beasts a little bit. This game has something for everyone. It has cool monsters, it has sleek monsters, it has furry monsters, it has monsters that literally look like humans, it has everything. Other than that, I definitely think Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince is worth the price. It's a full-scale game. It has a ton of content. It has over 500 monsters that have a lot of complexity thanks to the synthesis system present within the game. It's got a great campaign. Oh, and it also has online PvP for those interested in the competitive scene. I'm not going to go too much into the deluxe content because I do want to do that in a separate video. However, what I will say is whether or not you decide to buy it, I do think the game's worth the cash, and I would recommend it to any monster taming fan, whether you're a massive Pokemon fan looking for something until the DLC drops, or someone who's looking for something to sort of scratch that Pokemon itch because you've moved on from the franchise, or maybe you're just a big monster taming enthusiast and this is just the next big title. I'd say go for it. I honestly want to see more games like this. Fans of the recent other big hitting monster taming games like Monster Hunter Stories 2, Shin Megami Tensei 5, or even Digimon World Next Order will find something that they love about this game, and I highly recommend you check it out. My biggest hope is that the Dragon Quest Monsters series continues to flourish in the West and we don't get left out from future Dragon Quest Monsters titles like we did with the Joker iterations. I've had way too much fun with this game for it to be the last one we see. Other than that, if you are a fan of monster taming games like Dragon Quest Monsters, I highly recommend you subscribe to this channel because we put out new monster taming videos every single day. We cover new monster taming games, upcoming monster taming games, guides, breakdowns, let's plays. I have a news segment that comes out every week on all the latest monster taming hype, and I'm sure you'll find games you've never even heard of over here. I also wanted to say special thanks to our supporters, especially Jim Hamilton, Dro Ghost, Candy Marunci, and Tragsoft. And if you do want to become a channel member or patron, check out the description for all of that fun stuff. I will see you guys next time. Peace out.